This is Howl by Allen Ginsberg. This is Howl by Allen Ginsberg. For Carl Solomon. Part 1. I saw the best minds of my generation, destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the black streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold-water flats floating across the tops of cities contemplating jazz, who barred their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedies among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall, who got busted in their pubic beards, returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York, who ate fire in paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, death or purgatoried their torsos night after night, with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls, incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mines leaping towards poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time in between. Peyote solidities of halls, backyard, green tree ceremony dawns, wine drunkenness over the rooftop storefront burrows of tea-head joyride, neon blinking traffic light, sun and moon and tree vibrations in the roaring winter dusks of Brooklyn, ashcan rantings and kind king light of mind, who chained themselves to subways for endless rides from Battery to Holy Bronx on Benzedrine until the noise of wheels and children brought them down, shuddering, mouth-wrecked and battered, bleak of brain, all drained of brilliance in the drear light of zoo, who sank all night in submarine light of Bixford, floating out and sat through the stale beer afternoon in desolate fugazis, listening to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox, who talked continuously 70 hours from park to pad to bar to Bellevue to museum to the Brooklyn Bridge, a lost battalion of platonic conversationalists jumping down the stoops, off fire escapes, off windowsills, off Empire States, out of the moon. Yakety-yakking, screaming, vomiting, whispering facts and memories and anecdotes of eyeball kicks and shocking of hospitals and jails and wars. Whole intellects disgorged in total recall for 7 days and nights with brilliant eyes, meet for the synagogue cast on the pavement, who vanished into nowheres in New Jersey, leaving a trail of ambiguous picture postcards of Atlantic City Hall, suffering eastern sweats and Tangerian bone grindings in migraines of China under junk withdrawal in New York's bleak furnished room. Who wandered around and around at night in railroad yard, wondering where to go, and went leaving no broken hearts, who lit cigarettes in boxcars, racketing through snow towards lonesome farts and who lit cigarettes in boxcars, racketing through snow towards lonesome farms in grandfather night, who studied Plotinus Poe, St. John of the Cross telepathy, and bought Kabbalah because the cosmos instinctively vibrated in their feet in Kansas, who loaned it. I take a little break. That's I lost my face. A little drink. All right, we're back. who loaned it through the streets of Idaho, seeking visionary angels who were visionary Indian angels, who thought they were only mad when Baltimore gleamed in supernatural ecstasy, who jumped in limousines with the Chinamen of Oklahoma on impulse of winter midnight streetlight small town rain, who lounged hungry and lonesome through Houston seeking jazz or sex or soup and followed brilliant Spaniard to converse about America and eternity, a hopeless task, and so took ship to Africa, who disappeared into the volcanoes of Mexico, leaving behind nothing but a shadow of dungarees and the lava and ash of poetry scattered in fireplace Chicago, who repeated on the West Coast investigating the FBI in beards and shorts with big, fat, pacifist eyes, sexy in their dark skin, passing out incomprehensible leaflets, who burned cigarette holes in their arms, protesting the narcotic tobacco haze of capitalism, who distributed super-communist pamphlets in Union Square, weeping and undressing while the sirens of Los Alamos wailed them down, and wailed down Wall, and the Staten Island ferry also wailed, who broke down crying in white gymnasiums naked and trembling before the machinery of other skeletons, who bit detectives on the neck and shrieked with delight in police cars for committing no crime but their own wild cooking, pedestry, and intoxication, who howled on their knees in the subway and were dragged off the roof, waving genitals and manuscripts, who let themselves be fucked in the ass by the saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy, who blew and were blown by those human seraphim, the sailors, caresses of Atlantic and Caribbean love, who bawled in the streets in the morning, in the evenings, in Rosen Guards and the grass of public parks and cemeteries, scraping their semen freely to whomever come who may, who hiccuped endlessly, trying to giggle but wound up with a sob behind a partition in the Turkish bath when the blonde and naked angel came and pierced them with a sword, who lost their lover boys to the three shrews of fate, the one-eyed shrew of the heterosexual dollar, the one-eyed shrew that winks out of the womb, and the one-eyed shrew that does nothing but sit on her ass and snip the intellectual golden threads of the craftsman's loom, who copulated, ecstatic and insatiate with a bottle of beer, a sweetheart, a package of cigarettes, a candle, and fell off the bed and continued along the floor and down the hall and endless fainting on the wall, with a vision of ultimate cunt and cum eluding the last gymnasiums of consciousness, who sweetened the snatches of a million girls trembling in the summer and were red-eyed in the morning but prepared to sweeten the snatch of sunrise, flashing buttocks under barns and naked in the lake. Who went whoring through Colorado in myriad stolen cars, NC, secret hero of these poems, coxman and Adonis of Denver, joy of these memories in his innumerable lays of girls in empty lots and dinner backyards, movie houses, rickety rows of mountaintops and caves with gaunt waitresses and familiar roadside lone petticoats, upliftings, and especially secret gas stations, solipsists of John and hometown alleys too, who faded in vast sordid movies and were shifted in dreams, woke on a sudden Manhattan and picked themselves up out of the basements, hungover in heartless Sequoia and homeless of Third Avenue iron dreams, and stumbled onto unemployment offices, who walked all night in their shoes, full of blood, on the snowbank docks, waiting for a door in the East River to open to a room full of steam heat and opium, who created great suicidal dramas on the apartment cliff banks of the Hudson under the wartime blue floodlight of the moon, and their heads shall be crowned with laurel in oblivion, who ate the lamb stew of imagination and digested the crab at the muddy bottom of the rivers of Bowery, who wept at the romance of the street in their push cars full of onions and band music, who wept at the romance of the street with their push cars full of onions and bad music, who sat in boxes breathing in the darkness under the bridge and rose up to build harpsichords in their lofts, who coughed on the 6th floor of Harlem, crowned with flame under a tubercular sky, surrounded by orange crates of theology, who scrambled all night rocking and rolling over lofty incantations which in the yellow morning were stanzas of gibberish, who cooked rotten animal lungs, heart, feet, tails, borscht, and tortillas, dreaming of the pure vegetable kingdom, who plunged themselves under meat trucks looking for an egg, who threw their watches off the roofs and cast the ballot of eternity outside of time, and alarm clocks fell on their hands every night for the next decade, who cut their wrists 3 times successfully, unsuccessfully, gave up, and were forced to open antique stores where they thought they were growing old, and cried, who were buried alive in their innocent flannel suits on Madison Avenue amid blasts of leaden verse and the tanked-up clatter of iron regiments of fashion and the nitroglycerin shrieks of the fairies of advertising and the mustard gas of the sinister intelligent editors, or were run down by the drunken taxicabs of absolute reality, who were jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge. This actually happened and walked away unknown and forgotten into the ghostly haze of Chinatown's soup alleyways and fire trucks, not even one free beer, who sang out of their windows in despair, fell out of their subway window, jumped in the filthy Passaic, leaped into Negroes, cried all over the street, danced on broken windglass, barefoot, smashed phonographic records of nostalgic European 1930s German jazz, finished the whiskey and threw up groaning into the bloody toilet, moans in their ears, and blast of colossal steam whistles, who barreled down the highways of past journeying to each other's hot rod Golgotha jail suite, watched or Birmingham jazz incarnation, who drove cross country 72 hours to find out if I had a vision, or you had a vision, or he had a vision, to find out eternity, who journeyed to Denver, who died in Denver, who came back to Denver and waited in vain, who watched over Denver and brooded and loned in Denver, and finally went away to find out the time, and now Denver is lonesome for our heroes, who fell on their knees hopeless in hopeless cathedrals, praying for each other's salvation in the night and breasts until the soul illuminated its hair for a second. Who crashed through their minds in jail, waiting for impossible criminals with golden heads and the charm of reality in their hearts, who sang sweet blues to Alcatraz, who retired to Mexico to cultivate a habit, or to Rocky Mountain to tender Buddha, or to Tigers to boys, or Southern Pacific to the black locomotive, or Harvard to Narcissus, to Woodland, to the daisy chain or grave, who demanded sanity trials, accusing the radio of hypnotism, and were left with their insanity and their hands a hung jury, who threw potato salad at CCNY lectures on Dadaism and subsequently presented themselves on the granite steps of the madhouse with shaven heads and harlequin speeches of suicide demanding instantaneous lobotomy, and who were given instead the concrete void of insulin, Metzerol, electricity, hydrotherapy, psychotherapy, occupational therapy, and ping pong and amnesia, who in humorless poverty overturned the only symbol, who in humorless protest overturned the only symbolic ping pong table, resting briefly in catatonia, returning years later, truly bald except for the wig of blood and tears and fingers, to the visible madman doom of the wards of the madmans of the East. Pilgrims, States, Rockland, and Greystone's fetid halls, bickering with echoes on the soul, rocking and rolling in the midnight solitude bench, dolmen realms of love, dreams of a nightmare, bodies turned to stone, as heavy as the moon. With Mother finally asterisked, and the last fantastic book flung over the tenement window, and the last door closed at 4 a.m., and the last telephone slammed at the wall in reply, and the last furnished room emptied, down to the last piece of furniture, a yellow paper rose twisted on the wire hanging on the closet, and even that imagery nothing but a hopeful little bit of hallucination. Ah, Carl, while you are not safe, I am not safe. And now you are really in the total animal soup of time. And who therefore I ran through icy streets obsessed with sudden flash of the academy, of the use of the ellipses catalogue of variable measure and the variable plane and the vibrating plane, who dreamt and made incarnate gaps in time and space through images juxtaposed and trapped the archangel of the soul between two visual images and joined the elemental verbs and set the noun and dash of consciousness between jumping with sensations of pater omnipotens erdana deus, to recreate the syntax of measure of poor human prose and stand before you speechless and intelligent and shaking with shame, reject yet confessed out the soul to conform to the rhymes of thought in his naked and endless head. The madman burned, an angel beat in time unknown yet, putting down here what might be left to say in time come after death. And rose reincarnated in ghostly clothes of jazz, in goldhorn shadow of the band, and blew the suffering of America's naked mind for love into Eli, Eli, Lama, Lama, Sabachthani saxophone cry that shivered the cities down to their last radio. With absolute heart of the poem, the life butchered out of their own bodies, good to eat 1,000 years. End of part 1. Part 2. What Sphinx of cement and aluminum bashed open their eyes and ate up their brains and imagination? Moloch, solitude, filth, ugliness, ash cans, and unobtainable dollars, children screaming underneath the stairways, boys sobbing in the armies, old men weeping in the parks. Moloch, Moloch, nightmare of Moloch, Moloch the loveless, mental Moloch, Moloch the heavy judger of man. Moloch the incomprehensible prison, Moloch the crossbones, soulless jailhouse and congress of sorrows. Moloch whose buildings are judgment, Moloch the vast stone of war, Moloch the stunned governments, Moloch whose mind is pure machinery, Moloch whose blood is running money, Moloch whose fingers are 10 armies, Moloch whose breast is a cannibal dynamo, Moloch whose ear is a smoking tomb, Moloch whose eyes are 1,000 blind windows, Moloch whose skyscrapers in the long streets like endless Jehovah's, Moloch whose factories dream and croak in the fog, Moloch whose smokestacks and antennae crown the cities, Moloch whose love is endless oil and stone, Moloch whose soul is electricity and banks, Moloch whose poverty is the specter of genius, Moloch whose fate is a cloud of sexless hydrogen, Moloch whose name is the mind, Moloch in whom I sit lonely, Moloch in whom I dream angels, crazy and Moloch, cocksucker and Moloch, lack love and manless in Moloch, Moloch who entered my soul early, Moloch in whom I am a consciousness without a body, Moloch who frightened me out of my natural ecstasy, Moloch whom I abandon. Wake up in Moloch, light screaming out of the sky. Moloch, Moloch, robot apartments, invisible suburbs, skeleton treasuries, blind capitals, demonic industries, spectral nations, invincible madhouses, granite cocks, monstrous bombs. They broke their backs lifting Moloch to heaven. Pavements, trees, radios, tons, lifting the city to heaven which exists and is everywhere about us. Visions, omens, hallucinations, miracles, ecstasies gone down the American River. Dreams, abominations, illuminations, religions, the whole boatload of sensitive bullshit, breakthroughs over the river, flips and crucifixions, gone down the flood, highs, epiphanies, despairs, 10 years, animals and screams and suicides, minds, new love, mad generations, down the rocks of time, real holy laughter in the river, they sought it all the wild eyes, the holy yells, the blade farewells. They bade farewells. They jumped off the roof to solitude waving. They carried flowers down to the river, into the streets. End of part 2. Part 3. Carl Solomon. I'm with you in Rockland, where you're madder than I am. I'm with you in Rockland, where you must feel very strange. I'm with you in Rockland, where you imitate the shade of my mother. I'm with you in Rockland, where you've murdered your 12 secretaries. I'm with you in Rockland, where you laugh at this invisible humor. I'm with you in Rockland, where we are great writers on the same dreadful typewriter. I'm with you in Rockland, where your condition has become serious, and it's reported on the radio. I'm with you in Rockland, where the faculties of the skull no longer admit the worms of the senses. I'm with you in Rockland, where you drink the tea of the breasts of the spinsters of Utica. I'm with you in Rockland, where you pun on the bodies of your nurses, the harpies of the Bronx. I'm with you in Rockland, where you scream in a straitjacket that you're losing the game of the actual ping pong of the abyss. I'm with you in Rockland, where you bang on the catatonic piano of the soul. I'm with you in Rockland, where you bang on the catatonic piano. The soul is innocent and immortal. It should never die ungodly in an armed madhouse. I'm with you in Rockland, where 50 more shocks will never return to your soul to its body again, from its pilgrimage to a cross in the void. I'm with you in Rockland, where you accuse your doctors of insanity and plot the Hebrew Socialist Revolution against the fascist National Golgotha. I'm with you in Rockland, where you split the heaven of Long Island and resurrect your human living Jesus from the supernatural tomb. I'm with you in Rockland, where there are 25,000 mad comrades all together singing the final stanzas of the Internationale. I'm with you in Rockland, where we hug and kiss the United States under our bedsheets, the United States that coughs all night and won't let us sleep. I'm with you in Rockland, where we wake up electrified. I'm with you in Rockland, where we wake up electrified out of the coma by our souls' airplanes roaring over the roofs. They've come to drop angelic bombs. The hospitals illuminate itself. Imaginary walls collapse. Oh, skinny legions, run outside. Oh, starry spangled shock of mercy, the eternal war is here. Oh, victory, forget your underwear, we're free. I'm with you in Rockland. In my dreams, you walk dripping from a sea journey on the highway across America, and cheers to the door of my cottage in the western night. San Francisco, 1955 to 1956. End of part 3. Thanks for watching. That's it, I suppose.